On a subject which is too big to be completed in the one meeting. It's the mark of the beast. You remember the reference in Revelation to the fact that there comes a time when everyone must receive the mark of the beast in his right hand or in his forehead. Otherwise, he's boycotted, he can't buy or sell, and so on. And like most things in the Bible, there's been an awful lot of utter rot preached about it by clergymen who don't know anything about the subject but insist on talking about it just the same. The book of Revelation, as I think all of you know, is entirely symbolic. And therefore, unless you are sure that you get the right key to the symbols, you can't possibly get the correct understanding of what it's talking about. So before we get down to that part of it, it's time that we understood what our symbols are, and then we'll know what we are talking about. The Bible offers the key, and it offers the only key to the symbols it uses. Lots of people undertake to try to decipher the symbolism of the Bible, and they go elsewhere than to the Bible itself for their information, and they're invariably wrong. Sometimes they try to do it out of their own cleverness, that they can figure this thing out. Sometimes they take Hindu or Egyptian or other pagan religions as the basis of their starting point, and they're always wrong. There is one place only where you can get the correct key to the symbolism of the Bible, and that is out of the Bible itself. Now, what we're going to talk about is a beast, and it's a very odd beast, obviously symbolic of something. Well, the book of Revelation is at the very end of the Bible, so we're going to have to look earlier into the Bible to find the key. And the first place we find where it's obviously talking about a very closely related beast is in the book of Daniel. And that's very appropriate because the book of Daniel is so deeply symbolic. It makes its first appearance in Daniel. Now you remember that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it impressed him so greatly it woke him up. And then when he woke up, he found he'd forgotten the dream. He remembered only that it was a thing of obviously great importance, and it worried him. This is in the second chapter of the book of Daniel. So King Nebuchadnezzar called in the wise men to interpret his dream for him. And they said, well, tell us the dream and we'll tell you the significance. And when he said, I've forgotten it, you tell me what the dream was, he punctured their bubble right then and there. They were pretending, of course, to be wise men and magicians and to have divine power and all that kind of thing, and they couldn't make good. So we had them killed, but Daniel said, well, don't be too hasty on this thing now. Give me a little time, and I believe God will give me the understanding of it, which he did. So Daniel interpreted the dream. He told him what the dream was and the interpretation of it. And that dream, you remember, was first of this great statue or image, which had a head of gold, the breast and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs were of iron, and the feet were mixed iron and clay. Now Daniel interpreted this for him. He said this shows 4 successive kingdoms, each of which is going to rule the then known civilized world in its turn. The head of gold was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. The silver and breast the breast and arms of silver were another kingdom which would come next. and would be somewhat inferior in its degree of civilization to Babylon. And we know that, of course, to be the Medo-Persian Empire. Then he said the belly and thighs of brass would be yet another kingdom, and we know that that was Alexander the Great's short-lived empire. And finally, the iron legs represented one more kingdom. And there's something in particular you need to note about that last kingdom, the iron one of Rome, because it keeps coming up again. In Daniel 2, verse 40, he said, "And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, as iron that breaks all these shall it break in pieces and bruise." And that language is significant because we keep coming back to that. Now, when Daniel interpreted this vision, the time was pretty close to 580 BC, within a few years one way or another of this. Babylon was at that time under its greatest king, Nebuchadnezzar, at the very apex of its power and its civilization. 2 kings later, it came to its end about 538 BC. Now, the head of gold, no question, that was the Babylonian Empire, which was then in existence. Now, the next one, which would come after it, he said, this was the breast and arms, of silver. Well, now the Medo-Persian Empire, 2 arms united in the one breast, 2 kingdoms, Media and Persia, united in the one empire. Media was the more northwesterly of the 2. It came to great power first. Later, it was in its turn conquered and absorbed by Persia, and the united empire, but under a Persian king, was the one which conquered Babylon. Its power became very great. It extended from northwest India and Afghanistan across the whole Fertile Crescent, the nations that extend in a great arch north of the Arabian Desert. In other words, from the head of the Persian Gulf on up through Iraq and Iran, as we call them today, but then you see the Babylonian and the Syrian empires, over into Syria, down the coast through Palestine. It took in a good deal of Asia Minor, which today we call Turkey, and even conquered and ruled Egypt for a time. So, starting this tremendous rise with the conquest of Babylon about 538 BC, this empire ruled all the important parts of the known civilized world of that time until it was conquered by Alexander the Great between 334 and 331 BC. Then that was followed by the empire of Alexander the Great. He had been king of Macedonia, which is on the mainland just north of the peninsula of Greece. And in 336 BC, he was merely king of Macedonia. The Greeks had a very high civilization and one fatal weakness. They never could get along among themselves. They were always fighting among themselves, the various Greek cities, because each of them represented an individual nation as they were then organized. And in their bitter warfare, whoever was losing was always ready to call in somebody else as an ally to keep from losing the war. And when you called in a powerful nation in those days to help, it simply meant that not only did they conquer your opponent, but they swallowed you up too. And of course, that's exactly what happened. In some of their bitter internal warfare, some of the Greeks called in the Macedonians to their aid, and Alexander had a very well-trained and brilliantly commanded army. There are two men in all past history who stand out as generals of ability beyond any other. One is Alexander the Great, and the other is Hannibal of Carthage. And it's perhaps a toss-up which was the more brilliant from a military point of view. So, under Alexander's leadership, the Macedonian army was irresistible. So he simply conquered and took over the various Greek cities and incorporated them into his beginning empire, and then went on looking for more worlds to conquer. He conquered Asia Minor, Syria, and Palestine by 332 BC. He conquered the Tigris-Euphrates valleys, making up the old Assyrian and Babylonian empires, by 331 BC. And he went on to conquer Media, Persia, what was then called Bactria, and today we call it Afghanistan. It lies just outside of India, just north of the famous Khyber Pass. It's the gateway to India. And went on down into northern India, conquering quite a considerable area in northern India. So that all the then known civilized world from Greece to India was incorporated in his one empire. And you remember, before his death, he was mooning around, worrying because there were no more worlds left to conquer. A brilliant general, and that's all you can say for him. A debauched drunkard also. And he finally died of his dissipation in Babylon in 323 BC. Now he had built nothing. He conquered, and as an individual king, backed up by a victorious army, he ruled the conquered nations. And when he died, there was nothing to hold it together. His empire broke up, and exactly as had been prophesied in Daniel, that his kingdom would be divided to the four winds of heaven and not to his posterity, because his four leading generals under him each took over approximately a quarter of the empire where they were. And in those few years, between 334, you might say, and 323 BC, this enormous empire was built and fell apart. So you've got Babylon, Medo-Persia, Alexander's empire, and now the next in line and the last in this series of Gentile empires that was prophesied by Daniel, Rome. The city itself was founded, according to their tradition, in 753 BC. The Republic of Rome was organized about 500 BC, and with the organization of the Republic began its expansion into a tremendous empire. Macedonia, Greece, and Egypt were incorporated into the empire in 168 BC, and from there they moved on into Western Asia, North Africa, and on, of course, into a good deal of Western Europe. Eventually, the Roman Empire ruled Italy, Spain, what they then called Gaul, which was France and extending very slightly into Germany, Macedonia, Greece, Egypt, North Africa, Western Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine. Its frontiers were the Atlantic Ocean, the Irish Sea, the south border of Scotland, the North Sea, the River Rhine, the Danube River, the Black Sea, the Caucasus Mountains, through Armenia to the middle of ancient Babylonia, the Arabian Desert, the Red Sea, Nubia, and the Sahara Desert and the Morocco Mountains. Those were its boundaries. Now the image, of course, had two legs, and so the Roman Empire broke up into two. It was divided into a Western and Eastern Roman Empire from about 283 A.D. The capital of the eastern portion of the empire was set up in what had been called Byzantium, and being rebuilt, modernized, made into a tremendous city by Constantine, had its name changed to Constantinople. And that remained the capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Now, while it claimed at all times to be the capital of the Roman Empire, you find it's generally spoken of as the Byzantine Empire, from the old, long-known name of Byzantium for its capital city. The western portion of it, which gradually was losing its hold on Europe, had its capital, part of the time, but not all of it, in Rome. For example, the city of Ravenna in Italy was capital for a time. This was broken by the Visigoths, who were Israel people on the march, in 410 A.D. You remember, under the pressure of the invading Visigoths, the Romans pulled the last of their legions of soldiers out of Britain, bringing them home for the defense of Rome in 408 A.D. That year they succeeded in buying off the Visigoth invaders. They had come into northern Italy, but they hadn't yet taken the city of Rome. They bought them off with a big money bribe. But by 410 A.D., the Visigoths had spent the money, so they took the city of Rome, looted it, and they smashed everything but a merely theoretical pretense that any further Roman Empire in the West existed. However, the Romans suggested to them, they were a wily people, that there were some wonderful lands, part of the old Roman Empire. Why don't you go move into them? There's some beautiful fertile country over in Spain. We'll give it to you. Only don't stay here. Well, it seemed like a good idea to the Visigoths. Centuries of frightful misrule under the Roman emperors had reduced Italy to such a stage of poverty and general falling apart, there wasn't much worth staying for there anyway. So the Visigoths moved out across southern France, through the Pyrenees, and into Spain. And from sometime a little before 420 A.D. until the Moorish conquest in 711 A.D., the Visigoths were the dominant people in Spain. Now, they didn't exterminate all the previous inhabitants of Spain, and in fact, some of the previous inhabitants of Spain were Israel people, for that matter, because the Vandals, a tribe who had moved down there from southern Scandinavia, were already in there. And they were not driven out immediately. They were not very numerous, and they later moved out into North Africa, where, of course, they were swept up in the Arab and Moorish Empire later there, and became extinct, as they were absorbed into the darker peoples there. But in Spain, then, you have a definitely Israel people, the Visigoths, as the ruling race, Portugal too at that time, the ruling race until conquered by the Moors. So that you will find in Spain today some people of Israel ancestry. Now, unlike the Scandinavian countries, which never were overrun by non-Israel invaders who left their blood behind, and therefore the Scandinavian peoples are a pure Israel stock, you cannot say of Italy or of Spain that as a nation they are Israel, because they're not. There's too many other people there. But you can say that among them are many who are definitely of Israel ancestry. The Western Roman Empire came to its end. All pretense of being an empire was abandoned by 476 AD. The eastern or Byzantine half of the Roman Empire was reduced to Asia Minor and the Balkan states by Muslim power by 650 AD. The Turks captured most of Asia Minor by 1074 AD. Between 1204 and 1260, the so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople, made up of the troops of the Fourth Crusade and the Republic of Venice, ruled briefly over the remaining territory, but the old Byzantine Empire was restored, at least in theory, actually governing nothing but Constantinople and its suburbs in the middle 1260s. And the last trace of it disappeared with the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 453, I should say, AD. Now, the first of these visions of Daniel, of this series of four great world empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Alexander of Macedon, and Rome, was given in the vision of the great statue, the image of the four different metals. Now, this was so important because, remember, the great bulk of recorded history is covered by this series of empires. That the thing was given again in a different vision to Daniel. For this we go to the 7th chapter of Daniel, and here now is where we start getting into these remarkable beasts. Daniel saw this vision himself. He said, 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. Now, as you know, the sea, as used in the Bible, is symbolic of people in the great mass, non-Israel people. So out of the great mass of non-Israel people, the Gentile empires in the true sense, you had 4 great beasts different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and he was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon its feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now, the word man in this particular sentence is the Chaldean word enosh, which is derived from the same root as your Hebrew word enosh, which distinguishes the non-Adamic peoples from the Adamic. See, wherever the Adamic peoples are mentioned, the Hebrew word Adam is used. Now, there is the word Ish, which means simply a male person of any race, and is used sometimes referring to Adamic people. But wherever the word Enosh is used, it is speaking of non-Israel people, and it is speaking generally in a rather derogatory sense. Now, I mentioned it was the Chaldean word. You remember that in the book of Daniel, it is written partly in Hebrew and partly in Aramaic. Now, the portions of the book that pertain to the non-Israelite peoples are written in the much more widely used Aramaic language, which took in everything from southern Babylonia way on up through the Fertile Crescent, through Assyria, Syria. In other words, it was spoken everywhere in Western Asia, other than in the earlier days in Palestine, when the related but not quite identical Hebrew language was used. So Daniel's vision of the first of these beasts that came out of the sea, it was like a lion. The eagle's wings were plucked off. It was made to stand erect on its hind feet like an Enosh man, and it was given the heart of an Enosh man. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had on the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now remember what was said about that 4th empire of Rome, the iron. The 4th kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all these things, as iron that breaks all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. So here again, this had iron teeth, was terribly strong. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped upon the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. Clearly again, a vision of the same succession of empires, and again making clear that this was Rome by a similarity of certain identifying features in the symbolism of it. Then the angel explained to Daniel the meaning of this vision. He said, These great beasts, which are 4, are 4 kings, which shall arise out of the earth. And Daniel said, Then I would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. So the angel explains it. Thus, he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of the kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and shall subdue 3 kings. Now you can go into some further symbolism in here if you need to follow this up, but for the present we don't. We've identified previously these different kingdoms in this succession of empires, so I'm not going to bother trying to identify each of the 10 horns and so forth now. We have other things to cover. But let's go back. The first kingdom was like a lion, and you remember in the vision of the great statue, it was the head, which was of gold, superior to the others in its degree of culture. Likewise, the power, the lion being the most powerful of the great beasts. It was a great military power with high civilization, but had only the characteristics of the Enosh. They lacked entirely the spiritual capacity of the people of Israel, with all their faults. Now the second kingdom, you remember, was like a bear, and it raised itself up on one side. Well, that's the Medo-Persian Empire. Originally Media, north of Persia proper, which was the leading kingdom during the first stage of the rise of this empire. Because as they expanded westward, they first shattered and absorbed the empire of Assyria, which lay north of Babylon. And that was done under the dominance of Media. Then Persia gained the dominance. So it raised itself up on one side. In other words, Media and Persia were not equal. The unequal power of two kingdoms in one. And it said there were 3 ribs in its mouth. It conquered and absorbed 3 great empires: Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. So your identification here is unmistakable. Now the third empire, the third beast that came up out of the sea of these Enosh peoples, was like a leopard. And certainly you couldn't have taken a better symbol. The swift, striking, terrible power. Now he said it had 4 wings and 4 heads. In other words, already, while it was still a single empire under Alexander, it had in it the seeds of its breakup into 4 parts. And dominion was given unto it. Yes, dominion it certainly had. Alexander conquered all that the previous empires had ruled. You see, he occupied and conquered Egypt. Then he went on to take over all that the empires of Assyria, Babylon, and Medo-Persia had ruled, including portions of northern India. Finally, the fourth one, a beast that was dreadful, terrible, strong exceedingly, and he would devour the whole earth. Well, it covered all the then known world, all that was civilized enough to be known at that time. All but the easternmost portion of the earlier empires. Rome didn't penetrate into Afghanistan, or as they called it, Bactria then, or Egypt. But it had everything west of that. Then it had what the other empires had never had. It had all of Europe except Germany. It had northern Africa. It was excluded from all the principal lands then occupied by the people of Israel. It only overran England, where the Israel people were as yet very few in number, because the bulk of the Israel people had not come into England. There were only a tiny handful there before the withdrawal of the Roman legions. It said it broke in pieces and devoured. And remember, as Daniel 2 verse 40 said, the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, as iron that breaks all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. Then Daniel said this fourth beast was diverse or different from all that went before it. It was. It originated as a republic. Now remember, while you had republics known in Greece before this time, They were small cities. They were not great empires. This is the first time in all history that you had a republic rising to the power of a conquering empire. As a kingdom, it kept its identity in force after the death of even its most powerful kings. The others tended to weaken and sometimes even break up when a great and powerful king died. But in Rome, you had a continuity of the empire as such for these many centuries. So this next vision now obviously concerns the same four empires. But now you've got a tie-in with the book of Revelation, because you have these four beasts rising out of the sea. As we shall notice when we get to the book of Revelation, where John was given the vision, it was one beast which rose out of the sea, but the one beast combined in itself the characteristics of the first four. So obviously you've got a connection there which can't be overlooked. Now, by way of more confirmation of this order, in the 8th chapter of Daniel, he was given another vision of a ram and a goat. He said, "Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Then I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with anger against him, and smote the ram, and broke his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up four notable ones, called the four winds of heaven. So the angel gives him the explanation of this. Now remember, this is prophecy before it happened. This is while Babylon was still at the apex of its power. The angel says, the ram which thou sawest, having two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Well, this was sometime in the middle third of the 500s B.C. 550, 545, somewhere in there. And the fall of Babylon did not come till about 538 B.C. So this was 2 centuries now before the rise of Alexander the Great. Now notice again the accuracy of prophecy. The ram had two horns, Media and Persia. Both were high, but one was higher, and the higher one came up last. Persia was the one that came to power later, absorbing Media. The rough goat. The cultured Greeks despised the Macedonians as being barbarians. Of course, for that matter, the Greeks despised absolutely everybody else in the world as being barbarians, because they recognized only two classes, Greeks and barbarians. But anyway, they looked down upon the Macedonians, maybe more than some of the others, because these were a rough, tough bunch. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And Alexander died at the very height of his power, 323 B.C. Now you remember in the earlier vision of the four beasts that came out of the sea, Alexander had been compared there to a leopard. I take this that I'm going to read now from the History of Nations, published by P.F. Collier and Sons. Alexander was one of the generals who win by rapid strokes and daring expedients. His long marches were perhaps the most characteristic part of his career. Urged on by him, his army seemed to be able to annihilate time and space. The rapidity of their motion was almost incredible. He was on the spot when his enemies believed him to be still hundreds of miles away. And when once arrived, Alexander had an eagle eye for seizing the moment to strike. He hardly ever made a mistake. His attacks, however reckless, succeeded to a miracle. So well compared to the leopard. The leopard is not a big animal. It's terrifically strong for its size. It's extremely fast, and it makes its attacks in just that way. Now, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. All the members of the family of Alexander the Great were assassinated in the struggle for power. So Egypt was taken over by his general Ptolemy I. Thrace, the old Macedonia in Greece, was taken over by Lysimachus. Syria and Asia Minor went to Antigonus, and Cappadocia and Paphlagonia, which were eastern Turkey and the areas inland to the south of it, went to Eumenes. And it says, not in his power. That is, it was not an orderly division of the empire, but each quarter was simply seized by a local commander as his own independent act. So the accuracy of Daniel's vision here is beyond any question. Now we're beginning to get into what the symbolism of this thing means. We're going to see where we start tying in some of this. Actually, it really begins in the 12th chapter of Revelation, Revelation 12, verses 1 to 5, before we start in to know what we're dealing with here. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Now that woman, unquestionably, is Israel, because you have here a repetition of Joseph's dream. Back in the book of Genesis, it says this about Joseph. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it to his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. The sun and the moon, obviously then, were Joseph's father, Israel, and his mother. 11 stars, of course. Joseph himself was the 12th, you see. So now you have a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, upon her head a crown of 12 stars, unmistakably talking about Israel. Then you have the next thing. The woman was about to give birth to a child which was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. A child who was caught up to the throne of God. Now, of course, that child who was to rule all nations is unmistakably Jesus Christ. He was born, of course, as we're reminded by Paul. He came, so far as the flesh is concerned, of Israel, of the tribe of Judah. And as far as ruling all nations, Revelation 19, verses 11 to 16. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he has on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And as to being caught up to the throne of God, in Hebrews 12, verse 2, it says, Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. And, as Jesus himself says, in Revelation 3, verse 21, To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame, and am set down with my Father in his throne. Now you're getting some more tie-in with Daniel here. The dragon that stood before the woman, ready to devour her child as soon as it was born, had 7 heads and 10 horns. Daniel's 4th beast, which was the Roman Empire, had 10 horns. The dragon, of course, is Satan. Here you have the tie-in emphasizing the satanic character of the Roman Empire. Remember what it degenerated into under the emperors. In his early days under the Republic, they produced some great men of stern and great character, although even at that stage their morals had decayed pretty badly. Under the emperors, it reached a point where it couldn't have gotten any worse, about like Hollywood today, plus more murders. So, Satanism, then, is the unifying theme which runs through all of this, showing its origin. The dragon stood before the woman to devour her son. Herod, the Edomite Jew, you remember, tried to murder the infant Jesus. In the 2nd chapter of Matthew, we're told about that. He slaughtered all the male children up to the age of 2 in Bethlehem just to make sure that he wouldn't fail to kill the right one. So you receive again, if you ever needed it, further confirmation of the satanic origin and character of the Jews. Now, let's get back to book of Revelation We're going now to the 13th chapter, where we're beginning to come to the beast. Daniel says, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea. So remember now, this beast is coming up out of the great mass of the non-Israel Enosh people. A beast having 7 heads and 10 horns. What did the dragon have? 7 heads and 10 horns. And the dragon, of course, is always representative of Satan. And upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. Now one beast, but having the composite characteristic of the earlier ones, so that whereas each of these had originally in its turn been all by itself a world empire, now you have something which would succeed them, which would take in all of these previous empires and have the same satanic character. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded unto death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy. And power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. Now, it's interesting to note some of the symbolism here, where you're dealing with something smaller than worldwide conditions. You're dealing with a single kingdom. Why, rivers are often used to symbolize a mass of people. Assyria and Egypt especially have been thus symbolized. And in Revelation 12, verse 15, speaking of that woman, Israel, who was persecuted by the dragon, it says, And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. Now that refers to the flood-like invasion of the Huns under Attila in the middle 400s A.D. You remember the people of Israel on their march out of Western Asia, around the southerly end of the Black Sea. They had to come up, some of them crossing between out of the southern end of the Caspian Sea, I should say, not Black Sea. Some of them came up around the easterly end of the Caspian Sea. Others came up around the westerly side of it through the Caucasus Mountains. And north of the Caspian Sea, they joined forces again, moved along the easterly end of the Black Sea, crossed the Crimean Peninsula, found the Danube Valley, and started northwesterly up into Europe. Now, it took them right across the path taken by the invading Mongolian Huns under Attila. So Satan was trying to cut them off from getting to their ancient homelands. The frightful numbers of these Huns, had they been and remained in the path of them, could have literally overrun them and exterminated them, or at least swept them up in the mass and mongrelized them. But God didn't allow that. God had promised in Isaiah 43, verse 2, "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee." So when this flood of the Huns came to intercept and carry them away, God held them back until the people of Israel had crossed this path. The very southernmost portion of them were still in the path of the invading Huns, and the rest of them had moved north, clear on up into Germany and on into the Scandinavian peninsula. Now, the tribes of the Goths were being driven westward. They came in the southerly portion. They were in the path of Attila's invasion, and they were driven westward before it. And the Visigoths, the West Goths, starting from where they had been in Hungary, moved on across into northern Italy, sacked the city of Rome, and as I say, as a body, they left a few stragglers behind probably, but the great bulk of them moved on into Spain and settled there. Then later, a generation later almost, as the flood of the Huns was coming in now, snapping right at their heels, the Ostrogoths, the East Goths, split. Some of them drove north clear to the shores of the Baltic, where they formed northeastern Germany, and part of them split off and went westward and into northern Italy. And those remained there. They set up a Gothic kingdom that lasted for some years in northern Italy, though eventually they were overthrown, but their people remained there. And in Italy, you will find today in northern Italy tall, blonde, blue-eyed people who were in no way related racially to the short, swarthy people of southern Italy and Sicily. And those are the remains of that Gothic invasion. But tying down now firmly our interpretation of the symbolism as to the significance of water, in Revelation 17, verses 1 and 15. And this shows you that the Bible is consistent in its symbolism, that it's being used the same in the book of Revelation as it was in the Old Testament. John said, "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters. And he said unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." So, out of the sea, then, this conglomerate mass of all the non-Israel people, rises this composite beast that has in one beast the identifying characteristics of all four of the beasts that Daniel saw separately in his vision. The 10 horns show that it's satanic, and they show that it's a continuation of the Roman Empire, which was the fourth beast of Daniel's vision. Then he says, "I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded unto death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." Now the head of the Western Roman Empire was wounded by the Visigoths in A.D. 410. Wounded unto death, it would seem, because they not only took away everything that had been under Roman domination in that area, but they captured and looted the city of Rome itself. And then the Vandals in 455 A.D., and the Ostrogoths in 493 A.D. Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths, made himself king of all Italy. Now, Rome had changed from a military and political capital to a religious capital. It was of no serious military or political importance from about 400 A.D. The capital of the empire, in a political sense, had been moved to Byzantium, Constantinople, in 330 A.D. So, here was one head of the beast wounded, as it were, unto death. As to what was happening all this time, the Emperor Constantine had issued his edict of toleration of Christianity in the year 313 A.D. Up to that time, paganism was the leading power in Rome. The emperors were deified and worshipped as gods, along with all the others, Jupiter and Mars and Venus and so on. So, Christianity became an officially recognized and tax-supported religion. At the same time, Constantine took upon himself the title of Pontifex Maximus of Jupiter. Now, just how much of a Christian Constantine was is something that is open to very considerable debate. He put up statues of pagan gods in Rome. All this after he issued his edict of toleration of Christianity in 313. In 325 A.D., this Pontifex Maximus, this chief priest of Jupiter, presided over the Christian Council of Nicaea. You had a great deal of division among the early Christians. Some of them said, we've got three gods: Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and they're three different individuals, and somehow or other they're still one, and it's a great mystery because we have no understanding of it at all. And believe me, it was a mystery to them, all right. And the others said, no, we have one God. And so they were quarreling bitterly over that, and this council was called at the demand of Constantine. He said, you're not going to continue fighting over this. You're going to have a council and get together and decide this. Well, it so happened that at this Council of Nicaea, the Trinitarians outnumbered the believers in one God. So, on the Supreme Court's famous one man, one vote basis, the Trinitarians won, and Christianity, which should have been a monotheistic religion, continued to be a polytheism of three gods who in some unknown way constituted one God. We, of course, know better. We know that we have one God who manifested himself to us as the Son, but who was also the Holy Spirit and the Father. Well, in 330 A.D., Constantine moved his capital to Constantinople, and on his deathbed in the year 337 A.D., he was baptized as a Christian. Up to about 376 A.D., the Roman Senate had a statue of Victory, where they burned incense to this goddess of victory at the opening of each session. The rise to power of the bishops of Rome began when Pope Leo the Great persuaded Attila the Hun to accept a huge money bribe offered by the emperor instead of capturing and looting the city of Rome in 452 A.D. And by the middle 700s A.D., Rome was really governed by the Pope. Well, this head had been wounded, as it were, unto death. But Charlemagne revived the empire in Europe. You remember he was king of Gaul. Then he conquered, made himself master of Italy and practically all Germany, as well as his own country, Gaul, which today we call France. He conquered and ruled part of Spain, some islands in the Mediterranean. So he became emperor, in fact, by his own ability. But in the city of Rome, he was crowned as Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. This, by the way, was the first time that an emperor had ever been crowned by a pope, and is the basis for the Catholic claim that the pope has the right to rulership over kings. Leo was there for a celebration of his taking over all of Italy, and while he was there, the pope came out with the crown in his hands and put it on Charlemagne's head and said, "I crown you Emperor of the Romans." Well, as far as Charlemagne was concerned, why quarrel about it? He already was, so if they wanted to recognize him as such, that was all right. But the church ever since has claimed that authority. So Charlemagne ruled as emperor until 810 A.D. But they continued now to call this thing the Roman Empire thereafter. The Holy Roman Empire, because the Pope claimed the power to dispense this. So the deadly wound was healed. The people, remember it says, they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him?" Well, Charlemagne overran the Saxon peoples of Germany, the Visigothic peoples of Spain, both of them Israelites, as well as the various turbulent peoples in Italy. He was victorious everywhere. By 888 A.D., his dynasty fizzled out. The last two kings were known as Charles the Bald. We got a little too much competition outside. Whereas the founder of this dynasty was Charles the Great, the last two kings were known as Charles the Bald and Charles the Fat. And so it fizzled out. In the absence of a strong emperor, Italy especially was torn by constant warfare between the various petty princes and independent cities. Anybody who could conquer a village of 400 people set himself up as a duke and aspired to conquer a neighboring village of 200 people and become an emperor. So there was an utterly intolerable chaos. These people were constantly fighting among themselves. In other words, you never could live at peace in your own city. If the petty ruler of your own city was not drafting you into his army to try to conquer the village 20 miles away, the ruler of that village 20 miles away was trying to conquer your city. And they were in desperate need of some strong authority to put down all this chaos. So they worshipped the beast, as it says. Whatever city or petty kingdom was getting the worst of it always appealed to some other more powerful king for rescue. And the rescue always meant that you were absorbed into the kingdom of the rescuer. Well, while the empire lasted, it was the emperor's policy not to allow any petty kinglet to grow strong enough to unify Italy. And both during the times when you had an emperor ruling and in the intervals between, the popes exerted all their influence to the same effect. Remember, the popes already ruled some lands in central Italy given them by earlier kings, and they wanted to extend their powers. So Charlemagne's dynasty ran out in 888 A.D., and after about a century of chaos, the Italians called on Otho I, king of Germany, to come and rescue them from the Hungarians. who were at that time devastating Lombardy in the north, and the Saracens from Africa, who ruled Sicily and were seeking to take over southern Italy. So, after making 2 expeditions into Italy to restore order, Otho I was crowned emperor by Pope John XII in 962 A.D. And this new emperor, the German king, his new empire was thereafter called the Holy Roman Empire, and it claimed to exist as such until the year 1806, 160 years ago. Now, after speaking of this strange composite beast with the characteristics of all 4 that Daniel had seen rising out of the sea, John goes on. This is Revelation 13, verses 11 and 12. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. The first beast came up out of the sea, remember. Now this one came up out of the earth. And he had 2 horns as a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. And he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and caused the earth and them which dwell thereon to worship the first beast, whose deadly wounds were healed. Now, this next beast, this one that had 2 horns like a lamb but spoke as a dragon, this is the papacy. It came up out of the earth, not out of the sea. Now, the many times the earth or world has been used symbolically, it has always meant the so-called prophetic earth or world. They were the areas near the Mediterranean Sea and containing the nations which were covered by these earlier prophecies. In other words, when the earlier prophets talked about the whole world and so forth, they weren't talking about Germany and Scandinavia. They weren't talking about the American continent. They weren't talking about China. None of these areas came in any way in contact with the peoples who made up the prophetic world. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. He dreamed a tree which symbolized himself in his greatness before that period of madness. He told Daniel, and this is in the 4th chapter of Daniel, I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was an important figure in all the prophetic world of his day. These nations that extended from the Tigris-Euphrates valleys west to the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And that tree, you remember, was chopped down, though the roots were left in the earth, and there was a band of brass and of iron put around the stump of it and so on. It symbolized not the entire Babylonian Empire, but Nebuchadnezzar himself. You remember he went through his period of madness to remind him that he wasn't as important as he thought he was. So you can see there the earth takes in not all the peoples of the world, but the prophetic areas here. So, the portion with whom prophecy was concerned at that time, the Asiatic empires had passed away. The development of power was in the Roman Empire, so this now constituted the earth symbolically at the time of John's vision. Now, the second beast had 2 horns like a lamb. The Pope adopted the title Vicarius Filii Dei, a substitute for the Son of God. Vicarius, one who acts as a substitute in the absence of another. But he said, yes, I'm a substitute for the Son of God. And our motto is the original and only genuine, accept no substitute. So, he claimed 2 horns like a lamb. He always claims that he exercises all the power of Jesus Christ. He says that he can forgive sins or he can condemn to hell and so on. So he tries to adopt the outward appearance of a lamb, but he speaks as a dragon. His power has been exercised in the interest of Satanism. He has taken over the office of Pontifex Maximus, who was the chief priest of Jupiter. So no mistaking this. He exercises all the power of the first beast before him, the book of Revelation says. Well, he claimed the power to confer the empire upon kings and to depose them. He wouldn't crown Frederick Barbarossa, who reigned from 1152 to 1189, until Frederick swore that he would conduct a crusade to recover Jerusalem. And he excommunicated and deposed Frederick II in the year 1245 AD. So, having horns like a lamb, but speaking as a dragon, he is exercising the power of the first beast, this composite beast, before him. In other words, there is a period in which the head of the composite beast has been wounded, it would seem as unto death, but the deadly wound was healed. But in the meantime came this second beast that had horns like a lamb but spoke as a dragon, and took over and exercised the power of the first beast before him. But getting down now to what we find in the book of Revelation, you get to the bigger thing here in the 13th chapter, beginning verse 1, where John said, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns." And later, when you get over into the 17th chapter, it tells you that this beast was scarlet in color, which again ties in with the dragon, which had 7 heads and 10 horns. "I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea." And the sea, of course, is symbolic of the non-Israel, Enosh people in general. "Having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. And the beast was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion." So here you see the characteristics of all of the 4 beasts that Daniel saw: the lion, the bear, the leopard, and this odd beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns. All these now were combined into a single beast. In other words, Daniel saw these things as the 4 empires coming into power successively. But John was shown the fact that these were nothing but several successive manifestations of the same power which manipulated these kings as mere pawns in the game. These empires were themselves only a part of something much bigger than themselves. And it says, "And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." This beast was definitely satanic. And that is this system which has antedated all these empires. It was in existence earlier. It is the same thing that operated continually through them. It's like in the case of pagan Rome. You didn't get any difference when one of these degenerate emperors was succeeded by another of the same stripe. It was still a manifestation of the same evil power. just under a different man on the throne. Then when you go over to the 17th chapter, he got the vision of this scarlet beast with a woman sitting, riding on the beast. And he was somewhat astonished at these unexplained things that he saw, wondering what they meant. So an angel comes to tell him about it. It says, "And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And here is the mind which has wisdom." And some of the translations say, here is a problem for an alert mind, a wise mind. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And they are 7 kings. Your King James Version says, "And there are 7 kings," as though this was something different. But the correct translation is, "And they," the 7 mountains, "are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. And the beast which was, and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goes into perdition." Now remember that John wrote this book of Revelation very probably about the year 94 A.D. That's about as close as we can date the thing. There's a possible leeway of 2 or 3 years before and perhaps 4 or 5 years afterwards. But that's approximately it, in the 90s A.D. Now, when you compare this with Daniel, you're getting into something more than Daniel had. Daniel had a vision concerning only 4 empires. Now, we're told that there are 7 in John's vision, of which 5 already are fallen. They've had their day and gone. And the 4th, the Roman Empire, was then just getting to its height in John's day. That would be number 6. So what are these things which were great world empires in their day and have gone and nevertheless are part of this satanic system? Of number 1, you can take your choice of 2. There's a difference of opinion among those who have studied this. I would say number 1 is Egypt. A very respectable writer, Seiss, would put the first one as Cain, or Nimrod's empire. Well, he takes Nimrod rather than Cain, but Nimrod's early Babylonian empire. I don't believe so for this reason. The Bible only goes into any particular detail about those things which in their day had contact with the people of Israel and influenced them. There's no mention whatsoever of the great kingdom of China, a vast empire covering an enormous continent, and which goes back thousands of years, and it's never even mentioned in the Bible. There's no mention of the very respectable in material ways, though pagan and evil, of course, civilizations of the Aztecs and the Incas on this continent. Again, because they never came in contact in any way with the people of Israel. Now, neither Cain's original empire nor Nimrod's affected the people of Israel. And therefore, I would say that neither of those identifications are likely to be the correct one, and that Egypt is probably number one of the series. That, of course, Daniel didn't have because Egypt had passed its peak. You remember that, somewhere around 775 B.C., Egypt was overrun and conquered by Negroes from the south. And they held it for about 75 years. And in that time, Egypt became the mulatto country that it is today, and all of Egypt's greatness was past.
Thank you. And now, Pastor Comparet.
Now, neither kings and